Amen. Well, you guys can take a seat. Good morning. My name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here at Revision. I'm excited to be here today. How about you? All right. So we have spent the last couple months walking through the book of James. And if you've been here, you know this already. And if you haven't, if this is your first time at Revision, this is just a fair warning to you. James is a rough book. He's just not a guy who beats around the bush or pulls any punches. He's just like body shots every single week. At this point, he's called us adulterers and demonic, and he hasn't even peaked until the beginning of chapter 5. That's where he really swings for the fences. And that's what we're going to dig into today, and then we're going to finish up the series next week, and then we're going to do a series on butterflies and puppies, just to balance it out a little bit, because we need to breathe. But if you have a Bible with you, you can open it up to the book of James, chapter 5. If you don't have one, you can follow along on the screen or in the Revision app. And if you need one, we have them in adult and kids versions, a whole bunch of colors back at the Next Steps table. Please grab one. We love it when they disappear. But as you're finding the passage, I stumbled across a story this week that really hit home for me in the context of what we're going to read this morning. And it's about a town just outside of Houston along the San Jacinto River called Highlands, Texas. And Highlands was a master planned community with huge lots, big pasture lands along the scenic river that had massive, gorgeous homes on them. It was designed to be a picture of the American dream. And if you went to Highlands, Texas, that's exactly what you'd think. But there was a problem beneath the surface of all the external beauty. In 1965, the Champion Paper Mill, which was located nearby, had contracted with McGinnis Industrial Maintenance Corporation to dispose of their industrial waste. And MIMC, in a stroke of pure genius, decided to dig unlined pits along the banks of the San Jacinto River and just dump the waste into those. Because as we all know, it's brilliant to put volatile organic compounds near the water supply. A couple years later, though, all the pits were full, and MIMC decided they'd just kind of abandon the site and not really tell anybody. And that was fine until the river shifted course over the next 4 decades. And the banks of the river, which at one point had formed a barrier between the toxic waste and the water, eroded. And slowly, for years, toxic waste began to seep into the water. Until 2005, when the Texas Department of Wildlife discovered the site and realized that there was an explanation for all the people who'd been getting sick with seemingly no explanation. And then in 2008, Hurricane Ike struck South Texas, and it made sure that whatever waste was still in the ground got lifted up and distributed evenly all across Highlands, Texas, and rates of cancer, digestive issues, and other diseases absolutely skyrocketed. And now, over a decade later, there's still ongoing litigation. MIMC, which is now Waste Management, has paid tens of millions of dollars to the victims. But here's the thing. If you went to Highlands, Texas, and drove through and took pictures today, it would still look like a picture of the American dream. It's beautiful. But the picturesque beauty on the outside masks an underlying toxicity on the inside. It looks like kind of what we all want, but the water you drink and bathe in and the air you breathe when you exist in that space is full of a deadly poison. And James this morning is going to very uncomfortably point out that a lot of us are living in a way that allows a certain area of our lives to look a whole lot like Highlands, Texas. Externally, things seem to be going great, but it's coming at the cost of a deadly, soul-shriveling, future-stealing corrosion in our souls. So beginning at James chapter 5, this is what he writes. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Good thing none of us are rich, huh? Unless, I don't know, is anybody rich? Any rich people in here? No? We don't like to admit that, do we? Like, even to our kids. Dad, are we rich? No. The Joneses down the street, they're rich. But this is what we do. So let's just get this out of the way real quick. If your household brings in $25,000 a year, that places you in the top 2% of wage earners among the 7.5 billion people on the planet at 25,000. 50,000 places you in the top half of 1%, and 100,000 places you comfortably in the top 10th of 1% of people on this planet. And some of you out there are students. You're middle school, high school, college, med school students. Some of you are like, I make negative $50,000 a year. Not me. It's for all them rich people out there. All right, but here's the 3 check marks that James uses to determine whether or not you are wealthy. Do you have any food, like in a cupboard or a fridge, stored away that you haven't eaten yet in the place where you live? Do you own more than one shirt? Do you have any money at all in the bank, in your wallet, in your pocket? If you check any of those boxes, you're rich. Some of you didn't even know you were rich when you came here this morning. Good news. You can call your mom on the way home. Mom, I'm rich. Right? This is great. The bad news, all that stuff James just wrote, he wrote it to you, and he wrote it to me, to every single one of us, and it's pretty intense. Like, weep and wail. Your wealth will testify against you. It'll eat your flesh like fire. God's judgment is coming upon you. And here's the thing. When James writes these words, it's not actually anything new or unique that he's saying. This isn't just a personal axe James has to grind with some rich people in his neighborhood that he didn't like. Almost every single word in these 6 verses is a quote from somewhere else in the Bible. This is like a really super biblical message. You guys are like, duh, it's in the Bible. But that's not what I'm getting at. James actually highlights this thread that occurs from the beginning of Scripture to the end. From the Old Testament, the law and the narrative and the prophets, through the New Testament gospel accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus, there is a distinct, unmistakable theme when it comes to the way God says we should treat our time and our money and the way God sees the rich in this present world. And if you were going to boil that theme down to one simple concept, it would be this: God cares about people. All of them. Every last one of them. The beautiful ones and the wealthy ones and the broken ones and the poor ones, all of them, God cares about people and his people, followers of Jesus, the church. He created us and he calls us to be in the business of caring about what he cares about. That's been his plan from the very beginning. You read Genesis and Exodus, and what God's doing is like calling this people out, setting them apart for himself so that they can shine like a light in the dark world that draws the nations to himself. In the book of Exodus, he takes this nation of Israel and he rescues them and liberates them out of bondage in Egypt. And he says, all right, you guys, I'm going to send you to a land that's flowing with milk and honey. I'm going to bless you guys. I'm going to hook you up because I want the world to see who I am through you. And here's how we're going to make that happen. He gives them a whole bunch of instructions for this is what it looks like. This is how we can really do it. In the book of Leviticus, God says, okay, this land I'm giving you, it's fertile ground. But when you go harvest your crops, don't harvest all the way to the edges of the field. You leave the edges for the poor and the needy and the hungry. Because there's going to be some years where you have a bumper crop, but your neighbors don't. And we don't know exactly why. Like maybe they got sick. Maybe they got injured and they couldn't plant on time. Maybe their fields flooded. So you take what's in the middle. You leave the edges because they need it. And when you pick grapes in your vineyard, do one pass through. And anything you miss and anything you drop, you leave for the people who are in need. Like as you are grabbing everything I've blessed you with, leave space for the people around you who do not have enough. And God just continues to hammer home this theme again and again and again. In Deuteronomy, he says, when you bring me an offering, and then you do a big old family barbecue with the rest of the meat, which is what they did, make sure it's not just your family that gets invited to that. Make sure everybody in your neighborhood, anybody in your neighborhood who's hungry gets a seat at the table. And God tells his people he expects them to give. He's like 10%. Of what you get, not 10% after all the other bills are paid, not 10% of like what's left over, if anything's left over at all. The first 10%, your priority ought to be anything that comes in, 10% goes to the temple in Jerusalem. And not because God needs it. The Bible tells us he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. But God looks at this people that he's shaping for himself. He's like, look, I don't need your money, but you need to give it so that you remember who it came from, and who really owns it. If you don't want your heart to get messed up, like you got to give at least 10%. He's like, and then every third year? Oh, check this out. We're going to give like the tithe every year, but then every 3 years, I want you to take 1/10 of everything you own. And instead of taking that to the temple in Jerusalem, just like pack it up, take it into the middle of town, and just pile it up there. We're going to make a big pile in the middle of every town. And then what we're going to do is take the pile and just distribute it to people who have need. God could not be more clear. He wants every person on this planet to be cared for. Like he cares enough about every human life that he came and died so that people could be forgiven and set free and reconciled to him. You better believe he wants to make sure nobody's going hungry. And he wants us to share his heart for that. It's what we're made for. And so he uses us as part of his provision plan for the people around us. We got people in our world who are desperate and needy and who are praying for their daily bread. And we are God's plan to deliver that bread. The theologian Martin Luther once wrote that our neighbors are masks for the face of God. That as we go out into our vocations and we work and we produce and we give, we are actually God's way of meeting the needs of the people around us. And that's always been God's plan from the very beginning, to call out a people who get it, who get that like what he did was reach down and plucked us out of hopelessness and brokenness and helplessness and gave us everything that we need. And we'll understand, like, if Jesus did that for me, if that's who God is, how can I do anything other than reflect him to this dark and hurting world around me? How can I do anything other than meet the needs that are right in front of my face and bless people in a way that point them to the real hope and the real future that are available in that God who rescued me? See, here's the problem. Like when God presented that vision to the nation of Israel, they forgot about it and they failed really quickly. And I think we do a better job of living out their legacy than we do living out God's vision. Because it's just so easy. It doesn't take very long to get a little bit of money, to have a really successful year, and to just decide, wow, look, I worked really hard and this came to me. I'm killing it. This is mine and I deserve it. And if it came to me, it must be for me. It's mine. And that's kind of a really nice feeling to have until you open up the Bible and read God's plan. And you move on from the law and you get to like the wisdom literature. Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and the word rich is almost used synonymously with being an idol worshiper in those books. Because God watches Israel like reject his design. He sees some people get rich and oppress the poor, and he's disgusted by it. He's enraged that people who have received so much from him would be comfortable giving so little to the people around them. And by the time you get to the prophets in the Old Testament, those guys are ticked off. There's this one point where Amos looks at the nation and he's like, look, you guys are stealing from God. You're robbing him and you're hoarding all this stuff for yourselves, and you're sitting in worship services looking at your watch like, oh my goodness, when is this guy going to shut up and be over? I got to go back to the market and make more money. Guess who your God is? It's not God. And so God's taken everything away. His wrath is going to be poured out. God blessed you in a way that meant nobody should be left behind, left out, or left wanting. And yet here we are. Like you failed to care about what God cares about, and that's just not going to work. And so James picks up on that thread, and he's like, hey, church, gut check moment. Do you value what God values? That's a really interesting question. Like if I asked you that question today, or if James like appeared on stage and stuck a finger in my chest and asked me that question, do you value what God values? I think our natural reaction would be to say yes. I really do. I really genuinely care about poor people not being hungry and having clothes and having shelter. I care about that, right? Most of us would say that. But if the follow-up question was, cool, that's awesome. Could you prove that to me using your bank statement? Like, let's just take a quick look. We'll see how much you're spending on you and then how much you're giving away and figure out whether you actually care or whether you're deceiving yourself. The thing is, I got a lot going on in this season. A couple years ago, though, I wrote a check to this one thing, and I value it. I care. It's, well, just like right now, like we know, like plenty of studies have shown Americans tend to massively overestimate our generosity. Like our hearts are deceitful, and nobody will lie to you more than you. If I want to know where your heart is and how aligned your heart is with God's heart, I don't need to hear what you say. I just need to see how you spend. Your wallet is actually an incredible gift from God. It's not only provision for you, it's a real quick heart check. And James knows that most of us are not doing as well with this as we'd like to think we are. And so he says, hey, all you rich people, all you people who have more than you need, listen up, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming to you. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like this is a weird verse because I don't usually walk around associating weeping and wailing with having a lot of money. I usually associate partying with that because you don't got anything to cry about anymore. You have no more worries. And James is like, weep and wail. And he's not saying like, shed a little tear and feel kind of bad about it. This word he uses for wail is actually an onomatopoeia, like one of those words that sounds like what it is, boom, crash, bang, bam, all right? The word he says is alaluzo. And James is like, listen, you got more than you need. You make noise when you cry. You need to be on your knees like, oh, lose. Oh. That's what it literally says in the Bible. This is what James is getting at. He's like, man, this is messed up. But why? Why do that? Because something's coming on down the line where the wealth you've collected that right now you think is your security will be your embarrassment. This thing that you think is your source of comfort will cause you great pain. And he explains that in verse 2. He says, your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. James is like, you got so much, you can't even use it. And there are people around you who don't have enough. You're checking all three boxes for wealth in the ancient world. You got food that's rotting while people go hungry. You got extra clothes while people go naked. And you got all this money sitting around rotting in the bank while people around you have desperate need, and God is not cool with that. He has a problem with people who have more than they need and decide to just hoard it for themselves just in case. Who keep it because they're worried about having enough for every eventuality. And if you guys are anything like me, you probably have a bad case of just-in-case-itis. You're like, well, I better keep that. I gotta hang on to that. I'm going to store that away just in case. You know, like I know that there's a need right in front of me, but what if maybe later in my life, sometime I have a need that could possibly happen, maybe. So I can't be giving stuff away. I gotta close my fists just in case I get sick, just in case something happens, just in case I get laid off, just in case something happens to my family, just in case, just in case. But that stuff that we're storing at the expense of blessing others, James says that's destroying us from the inside out, whether we realize it or don't. The word for corrosion here literally means poison. It's like we got all this stuff that looks good through the lens of the American dream, but it's a poison seeping into our souls and it's deadly. It'll eat your flesh like fire. James is just real subtle with the word pictures. But this matters. He said, these are the last days. Time is short. You got one life and one chance to make an impact. And what you're doing with that one life is taking the blessings God gave you and then just hoarding them rather than using them to bless the world around you. Like you're going to have to answer for that to the one who gave you the blessings. James is clear about this. One day you will be called to give an account for this one life. And if you're standing before your accountant or your financial manager, you might get a pat on the back. If you're measuring your life up against the standards of the American dream, all that stuff that you've accumulated might be evidence that you are nailing it. But when you stand before the King, when you stand before the Creator who loves the people your clenched fists didn't bless, all that extra stuff that you held on to and you hoarded will be the evidence used against you. That thing that is your security right now will be your shame. That's what James says. He's like, don't think God doesn't notice. In verse 4, he writes, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. It's like, look, rich people, all the cries of the people you could have helped but didn't. They've made their way to God, and he's taking notes, and he's not a God to be trifled with. Okay, this phrase that he uses here, the Lord Almighty, is, I think, one of the most powerful, awe-inspiring, scariest names for God in the entire Bible. There are a whole lot of names for God in the Bible, but this one is actually a Hebrew word. He says he's the Lord Sabaoth. It means commander of the armies of heaven. James is saying, listen up. Someday, with all the warriors of heaven standing at his side, you will stand before God, and he will ask you the question. He will pull out your bank statement and your 401k and all your stuff and say, I gave this to you in a world that was shattered, full of desperate need. What exactly did you do with it? I think for so many of us, he's going to have to look at us and be like, yeah. I know that you saved because you were planning for the future, but you didn't plan far enough out. You were like focused on the wrong future. You aimed your life at this little future you call retirement that's like 15 years, maybe 20 at the longest if you're lucky, but you got nothing in your account for eternity. You've been keeping score on the wrong scoreboard. James writes, you lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You fattened yourselves in the days of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. And this isn't literal murder. He's using figurative language that maybe made more sense 2,000 years ago than it does today. But what he's saying is basically you enriched yourself at the expense of other people. You kept and spent more than you needed because you decided that if it came to you, it must be for you. So you took it. And you made sure that your lifestyle stayed right in line with your income and your Instagram goals. It's heavy stuff. It's heavy stuff for me to think about and talk about, but I want to be clear about something because I think this is easy to maybe misunderstand and misapply. The problem here isn't money. Money isn't bad. It's just dangerous, like fire. Fire can cook you a meal, it can keep you warm, and it can burn down everything you own. It's not bad, it's dangerous. And this is the same thing with money. The problem James is pointing out here isn't money. The problem James is pointing out here isn't being rich. It isn't even having way more than you could possibly need, and it isn't saving. The Bible's not anti-saving. James doesn't say that, and neither does anyone else. Proverbs says, look to the ant, you sluggard. Like, see what you need and plan ahead. But there is a difference between saving and hoarding. One is the pattern of a life that's humbled by stewardship, and the other is the pattern of a life that's blinded by ownership. Okay, so the problem that James is trying to highlight here isn't having more than you need. It's greed in the face of need. It's greed in the face of need. God gave you the extra money. He just didn't give it to you for you. But our issue is that that's what we're taught to assume from the day that we're born. It came to me, so it's for me, so I should spend it on me or save it for me later so I'm safe and I'm secure just in case. And for us, like when we get more money, our first lens is what can I spend that money on? Or how can I save that money for myself later? Our first lens isn't, wow, God maybe gave me this for someone else. How can I be generous with it? It's just not the way we think. And the tragic paradox of that is that the more we get, the less we tend to give. That's a measurable phenomenon, not just amongst those evil, awful, rich people 2,000 years ago that James was writing to, but in our society, uncomfortably enough. You know what the poorest state in the U.S. is? Mississippi. You know what the most generous state in the U.S. is by percentage of income? Mississippi. Like the AP recently reported on this, and they wrote, ironically, and I don't know if you can call it ironic at this point, like it's all of human history, but they're going for ironic. Ironically, the richest states in America are among the stingiest. None of the top 10 richest states crack the top 25 in charitable giving percentage. It seems that the wealthier Americans get, the less they tend to give. And sadly, what we know is that Christians, the church, we are actually a part of that cultural trend and not an outlier to it. Why? Because so many of us either never understood or forgot why God says he's blessing us with more than we need in the first place. So why is it? Like, why does so many of us have more than we need? And what does God want us to do with that? I think it's a fair question to ask. It's an uncomfortable question to ask, but it's fair. And it's fair to ask God what he wants us to do when we have more than we need, because every one of us asks God when we have less than we need, right? We don't hesitate to be like, God, I got a problem. Even those of you who are here and you're skeptical about faith, you're like, I don't even know if I'm a Christian. When you have a desperate need, you're praying to something, hope it like, oh, I don't know, I can't do it. Please help me out, figure it out. God, what should I do? I don't have what I need. But when we have more than we need, we don't ask that same prayer. We just assume that God gave it to us because he doesn't want us to worry. Like he's up there in heaven looking down on us like, oh man, I can't have you worrying. Here's more. Is that enough? That's not, I'll just give you a little bit. I don't want you to be in a spot where you're going to have to trust me. That'd be terrible. Just more. Are you feeling financial peace now? The Bible's pretty clear that peace is not a fruit of our finances. Peace is a fruit of the Spirit. And most of us know that usually getting more money creates more worries. We've been sold by our world on this lie that if we can just get enough and keep enough and build up enough and hoard enough, then we're finally going to be happy, and we're finally going to be secure, and we're finally going to be safe against any eventuality, and we're going to get rid of our just-in-case-itis, and it'll be great. But the evidence of our lives and the evidence of the lives of everyone around us suggests that the opposite is true. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said it like this: riches and abundance come hypocritically clad in sheep's clothing. Pretending to be security against anxieties, they become then the object of anxiety. Riches secure man against anxieties just about as well as a wolf that is put to tending the sheep. Or if 19th century Danish existentialists aren't your thing, there's a notorious 20th century philosopher from New York City who said the same thing in less words. More money, more problems. Right? And we know he was right. Like we've lived out those words. So what do? Like as rich people who've been given more than we need, how do we respond to James's powerful warning here? How do we start planning farther ahead, like for eternity, not just for retirement? What does that look like? What's the appropriate number? What's the percentage to donate so that we're good with God? Because we all got dreams about stuff we'd like to go out and get for ourselves. So how much do we need to give away before that's a cool thing to do? It would be so awesome if God answered that question. It'd be really great if you could crack open the Bible and just get the answer to like, what's the number or what's the percentage? But God doesn't do that. He'll never give you a number. Even the number that he gave in the Old Testament, 10%, that wasn't like, that's the good number. He's like, no, that's like the floor. That's the minimum if you don't want your heart to get all jacked up. Start there, but then like poor people around you, like piling stuff in town, like there's offerings above that. There's a whole lot more, and he never gives a percentage because it's not about a number, it's about a mindset. And the Bible, like you can read it cover to cover, it will never tell you when you've crossed over that threshold to like the way that you spent your money being used as evidence of your generosity rather than being used against you as evidence of your greed. It's just not going to tell you that. Which probably means for us, we need to radically reframe the way we think and start asking an entirely different question than the one we're asking. The great 18th century pastor and theologian John Wesley, he was a student at Oxford University, went out one day and bought some pictures and frames to decorate his dorm room. As he got back to the dorm, he laid them down to begin hanging them, and he noticed that the chambermaid at the dorm didn't have a coat on, and it was a frigid, cold winter day. And so he asked her about it, and she informed him that she couldn't afford a coat. And that kind of tugged at Wesley's heartstrings, and he decided to give her some money to go buy a coat. And he looked through his dorm and scrounged up all he had and realized he had spent almost all of his money on wall decorations. And the contrast between his ability to purchase decorations for his walls and her inability to stay warm in the winter wrecked John Wesley. He wrote later that he made a decision that day, not that wall decorations were bad, but that giving was better. And he resolved to control his spending as much as he possibly could so that he could give away as much as he possibly could. And he calculated that he believed he could live on 28 pounds a year. And the first year John Wesley worked, he made 30 pounds. He lived on 28 and he gave away 2. The next year his income doubled. He made 60 pounds. He lived on 28 and he gave away 32. The next year he got a book published and he made 90 pounds. He lived on 28 and he gave away 32. In the 4th year, John Wesley was beginning to be famous, kind of as a speaker and an author. He made 120 pounds. He lived on 28, and he gave away 92. And then he got audited because the government was like, this guy's crazy. No one's doing this. He's going to be 75%. He's nuts. He's a liar. But the thing is, John Wesley was playing on a different scoreboard than the one so many of us are playing on. He had resolved that as his wealth increased, it was a chance to raise not his standard of living, but his standard of giving. He knew who the money belonged to. He knew where it came from, and he knew why it came to him. And he knew too, he wrote about this, that if our standard of living increases at the same rate as our income, something inevitable occurs. We actually become less generous. We seem to be doing better by all the measurements of our economy, but in God's economy, we're less generous, we're having more capacity, and that's going to be a tough thing to stand before him and defend someday. Because God cares about people, and he's blessing us so that we can be part of his provision plan for the world around us. And so the problem James is trying to draw out here, the thing here that God is angry about isn't money. It's greed in the face of need. And the solution is to change the question that we're asking. Because we all got this question that we naturally ask. Anytime we get anything, especially if we're trying to be faithful, we're trying to do it God's way. Whatever money comes in, our lens, our filter, our normal question is to ask, how much of my money should I spend on God? But if we're going to conquer this issue that's profoundly human and real and alive in every single one of us, this issue of greed in the face of need, we got to do a reality check and think about the source and the provider and the owner and the purpose of that money, and flip that question entirely upside down and start asking, how much of God's money should I spend on myself? That's a game-changing question to ask. I mean, it's a massive shift in the way we think. It'll make a massive impact in our lives and our world. And it may sound totally scary to you. It may sound like I can't even imagine asking that question and thinking through that lens every time I get money. I don't even know if I can do it. But every one of us in this room knows exactly how to do it. We know what it looks like as it plays out in real life, and I'll prove it to you. Imagine for a second that you take your kid, we're going to call him Johnny, to the park with a neighbor kid, Joey. And you're going to hang out and play at the park for a while. So you pack Johnny a lunch, and Joey's mom packs Joey a lunch. You go to the park, and they play for an hour, and then they get hungry, and you already ate. So you sit down at a table to help them open up their lunch boxes. And Johnny pulls out a sandwich, and Joey pulls out a sandwich, and Johnny pulls out a banana, and Joey pulls out some grapes. And Johnny pulls out his juice box, and then he gets mad because he can't get the straw, and you help him. And then you do the same thing for Joey, because kids cannot figure out juice box straws. And they have a nice little lunch, right? And then Johnny pulls out the 4 cookies that you packed him. And then Joey looks in his lunchbox and he starts rooting around and his face drops. Because Joey's mom didn't pack him any cookies. A quick time out on the story. We can all answer this out loud together. What is the one word that's going to come out of the mouth of every single parent in this situation? Share. Share. But they're mine. No, there's 4, 2 and 2. Just share. And let's be straight for a second. If your kid recognized that before you told them, like if you sat there and watched little Johnny be like, oh, Joey, it's okay. I have 4 and you have 0. That's 2 for each of us. None of you. No parent in this room would be like, great. That's the end of the free enterprise system. Right out the window. This dumb kid doesn't understand personal ownership of property. Right? No. Every mom in here would be fumbling for her phone to get a picture so she could humble brag on social media about her little sharer. Right? We know it. Why? Why is this so simple for us when it comes to shaping the way we want our kids to see the world? And so difficult for us to see the world that way when we walk out and deal with big people problems. It's because in our minds, from our limited human perspective, the stakes are a whole lot higher. But I promise you, God is sitting up there in heaven watching us say mine. Being like, can you just share the cookies? I got more cookies. We're not out of cookies. Like he cares about the people and the need that's right in front of us. And he's calling us to be a part of meeting those needs. Why do you have more than you need? Because God has a need that he wants you to meet. That's probably why. And I think if we don't do it, we're going to miss out. Like a world in desperate need that we were meant to bless will suffer, and we will too. We'll be stuck in this prison of anxiety and materialism, just like the Highlands, Texas. On the outside, will look like a picture of the American dream, but on the inside, our greed will be eating away at our souls and poisoning our future. But if we do it, if we decide, all right, this is hard, this is not easy, this is counterintuitive, this is countercultural, but I'm going to come to God with open hands. I'm going to stop asking how much of my money I should spend on him and start asking how much of his money I should spend on myself. I'm going to start trying to radically be generous and meet the needs in front of me. I think we can actually make a dent in the needs around us. I think we can point desperate people toward the God who can rewrite their futures, and I think we'll find liberation, meaning, and joy in the process. Will you guys pray with me? God, thank you. Thank you so much for reaching in and rescuing us out of our hopelessness, out of our brokenness, out of our need. Would you just do a thing in our hearts? Would you help us to see the people around us the way that you see them? It's hard. And every one of us struggles in this area. We struggle not to hoard. We struggle not to cling to our things like they're a source of security and safety. But would you just remind us today that you are the source, that you are our security, that when we find it in you, we don't need it anywhere else. Would you bless us so that your blessings can flow through us in a way that points the people around us toward your incredible, eternity-shaping love? We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.